welcome to Talent Agnostic, Gigstart's weekly podcast where we bring together experts from across the tech market to discuss best practices on how to scale your startup. Today, I'm joined by Mike Holmes, an experienced data science leader in financial services, currently at Provenir AI. It's great to have you on, Mike. How are you doing?
Great to be here. I'm doing good, thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Pretty well. New financial year, new series of podcast episodes coming up. So super busy. But yeah, great to have you on. And I think it's especially interesting for the audience to hear from a data scientist perspective. We haven't had a guest on yet in that area. So I suppose to get started, it would be really good for the audience to know a bit more about you. If you could just get into your experience and what sort of led you to your current position as well, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll start at the beginning. I did maths undergrad, and my first job was as a risk analyst. I've always worked in financial services. 15 or so years ago when I started in the industry, data as it is now as a domain was a lot less mature. Financial services was probably light years ahead of where many other sectors are, largely because of regulatory requirements in that industry. And I've loved working in financial services. It's a domain where it's got some great problems to solve. I think you can make a really impact to people's lives. Your money is very, very important to all of us in the modern era. And over time, I've gone from being in that risk management role and get more and more into data. I've worked at a number of corporates, and more recently, I've worked at a lot of smaller companies, branching out beyond risk management into data in commercial, marketing, finance, operations, HR, all of the other areas. And I very much believe that data is that lifeblood and that glue in any modern organization.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because sometimes I've seen some organizations have this separation when it comes to data, maybe the more commercial aspects. But at the same time, a lot of the data scientists I speak to enjoy seeing the direct impact that data has on the commercial operations of a company. So I suppose from your perspective, Mike, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Do you have a lot of experience seeing the impact directly? I know you mentioned, the commercial and marketing side, for example. Can you say a little bit more about your experience in that area and how data can plug into a company commercially?
Okay, so where data fits into an organization is very much an org structure decision. If we get into like having a centralized center of excellence team versus a decentralized team where data's sitting at the coal face of a particular domain, I think it's good to have a hybrid strategy so that data assets are managed holistically across the organization, and there's like common tooling and a common best practice. But equally, data is most powerful in delivering impacts and actually getting close to the domain experts, and the problem is really critical in my view to delivering impacts. So I like it when there's data people that are working directly in marketing or in risk management or in finance, as long as they're connected as a broader community in the organization.
And I suppose that becomes the question. I mean, what do you think would be the best way for organizations to be able to connect those teams together? I mean, have you seen it work well in the past before, for example?
So I can probably explain more how I've seen it work badly to start with. I remember working at a smaller organization and seeing examples of how teams are creating their own pseudo data function because they had a problem, they had data, and they didn't know what to do with it. And creating lots of siloed teams was a bad way forward because we wouldn't share knowledge across the organization. Now, in that instance, I had no blocker in data being used to make the right decisions. But I thought it was really important that actually the data community in the organization were connected and can share knowledge. So, for example, what you do from a marketing perspective, they then become your customers. And it links to operations and it links to finance. Everything links together as that data blood flows around the body of the organization. So I guess in terms of describing what I thought worked badly there, I can probably describe one of the things that I think would work well is to, whether you have a centralized function or a decentralized function, you think about how data is connected across the organization, how you can both solve specific problems and think small, but also think big in terms of a strategy of how the community will work together.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And if we get into community and building data teams as well, because that's an area that you have quite a bit of experience in, would you have any tips from, let's say, an early stage startup or a data science leader who's coming in, basically to build things up from the ground up? What approach would you take to building the team, and what sort of culture would you be going for in building that data function out?
Okay, so if it was a first hire, I'd probably be looking for what I would call a data generalist, somebody who does a little bit of everything, either because they've done several jobs or because they'll happily get stuck in. Because you don't need a full-time data scientist, a full-time data engineer, a full-time data analyst. You need a little bit of everything. And over time, moving from data generalists to more specific roles. I often like to bring in people who are towards the start of their career. They're very hungry to learn. They've got some competence in the field, but they're still deciding where they want to specialize in later. And actually having those generalists in first, and if you do scale a team, you then have great optionality around where you strengthen in other areas, and you'll see that team build up. And you don't have to guess about what your target state needs to be. I also think that a great hunting ground to hire in people is people that work elsewhere in the business. So if you're working in a mature business with an immature data function, actually bringing someone in from, say, operations or finance who've worked there for a while, has got a passion for data, but not necessarily an expertise, but understands business processes inside out. That's fantastic. To understand how the business works is really crucial for being successful in a data role.
Yeah, and I suppose that would mean upskilling or training would be quite an important part, would you say, when it comes to sort of running a data function?
Absolutely. I mean, data is a huge domain in terms of knowledge to learn, but equally understanding the context of your business is huge to learn. So, given that I'm going to have to teach something. Sometimes it's easier to teach data skills than it is business knowledge, as long as the passion is there from the individual, where they want to learn, they're excited about the field. There'll be a self-starter in growing their skill set.
Sure. Now, something I've seen some founders struggle with before, especially if we're looking at seed and earlier stage startups, but also sometimes Series A as well, is when it comes to making that first data hire, which you mentioned earlier, they're unsure of whether to hire a data scientist, as you said, a fresh grad, basically, someone who can then build up experience and then work their way up to a head of data, or to just hire a head of data and work their way from the top down. From your experience, I mean, what do you think would be the best option?
So hiring a data scientist in first is probably the worst thing to do. And I say that because data scientists deliver things like machine learning models that are dependent on good quality data assets, data governance, data architecture, all of these supporting elements, for want of a better phrase. So if you, and I've seen this before, data scientist comes in on their own, it's hype. You think about all the sexy things a data scientist can do, but they're not enabled to do that. Unless they can deploy and make business impact with data science, that's the wrong person to bring at the wrong time. On the flip side, I'd be thinking about bringing in either a data engineer that would have to organize the assets, or a data analyst to be able to find basic insights, or actually focus on data governance if you have data at the core of your strategy and you want to build it up in a sustainable way. Or you wrap all those things in one and you find someone who's a data generalist. Now, that data generalist might be a head of data and you work your way down and build a team around it, or it might be somebody who's an individual contributor but quite experienced in their field. Either way, I think that first hire needs to both get stuck into the trenches, because there's no point bringing in a manager that doesn't do any work, or they do the work but they also need to connect with the strategy and see the bigger picture and connect well with the business stakeholders so that they don't feel lonely and siloed.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to compare it as well to go-to-market hiring because, for example, we've seen lots of situations where a company, let's say, is opening up a new function or expanding to a new market and they hire a VP of sales first. And then that VP of sales gets into a role where they're both doing the same role as an individual contributor. So getting really stuck into the business, but also then as a hybrid manager as they start to build out the team. So in some ways, that's almost like a data generalist role, in that, they have to cover a lot of different bases. But I mean, what do you think in that regard? I mean, is it very much its own thing, or would this approach also apply to maybe other teams and other functions too?
Absolutely, it's the same thing. When you look at the details, they are going to differ between sales and data, but when you look at the principle, it's the same idea. If you've got an early stage company, you don't have room for lots of layers of management and bureaucracy. You want everyone to get stuck in. You want to have a small team that's very focused on working towards those goals. And as you grow, you're bringing someone who's a specialist manager who can lead and coordinate a large function, and they're enabling others rather than being that individual contributor. So yeah, it's exactly the same principle, and I think sometimes, I certainly see it in data. We speak as if we're unique in a discipline to everybody else, but we're not. I think when you take a step back, every business unit you should look at in the same way, those same principles around starting a company or going through those stages of business maturity.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's also part of the reason why we see a lot of organizations say, this is our company culture. It's not our team culture. It's not just, the sales team's culture or the way that they want to approach things. This is the culture that we want across all functions in an organization. So again, yeah, to back your point up there, Mike, yeah, it makes sense that it would be consistent across the board. So something I'm quite curious about, and actually just in general in Gigstart, is what in terms of the ways of using data in the hiring process as well. So for example, we conduct quite a few surveys and we have talent insights into the market and we use salary data. But something I'd be interested to hear about from your side is, how would you use data in the hiring process? Have you ever sort of got any examples of the past where you have used data in the hiring process, for example?
Yeah, I have. Firstly, I'll say that there's a danger in looking at data that might be biased or very small sample. It might give you the wrong signal. But I can give you an example of where I worked in an organisation where I was working with the HR team there, just trying to understand some things about the hiring process across the organisation. So they used a recruitment platform that had very basic native reporting, but there was a rich data source under the bonnet that I helped to extract and see what trends there were. Now we're talking tens of thousands of applications, so that to me is good number of good amount of data to be able to say that there's some firm trends there. And some of the things that we discovered were just supporting in our intuition. We found the longer a candidate was in the pipeline, the less likely they'd get hired. But we were able to define it a little bit more. We found a critical cut-off point that then defined a policy that said, look, we need to get all candidates through the pipeline in 2 weeks. and we just used data to reinforce what was already known to us. But equally, we found what turned out to be, I guess, false signals. We found that the more emails that we got from a candidate actually made it less likely for them to convert. Okay, well, why is that? And we could drill down into and say, well, actually, there's less emails. Does that mean that there's more phone calls, or does it mean that there's more because there's more emails? Does that mean the process is taking longer? So it generated some interesting conversations, but data wasn't going to be the be all and end all about how we thought about refining our hiring strategy. It was really interesting to do some myth busting and actually say, is our intuition and data saying the same thing? And if it doesn't, why is that? And we had some really good conversations from that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is quite interesting. Obviously, we've seen from our side as well, keeping candidates in the hiring process for a very long time can have a negative impact, obviously, on the candidate experience. So it makes sense, but it's always good to use data, as you say, not as the be all end all, but to help you make informed decisions. So say, for example, if you were looking to refine your interview strategy and you want to go from, let's say, 4 or 5 interview stages to maybe 2 or 3, perhaps looking at the data could help determine what might be the best way to approach that. Actually, a couple of other interesting things as well that we've seen from our side, and I'm not sure if you have any experience in this area, but in addition to candidates sort of rejecting offers or not taking offers, we've also seen some clients talk about interview no-shows and the chances of that happening. I mean, do you know, out of interest from your experience, if there's any data on that, or what might be the cause behind interview no-shows, or if there's any way of predicting that?
So I don't have a data answer for that. But, I mean, actually, in that example I gave, we never captured that data. We just said, like, the interview was failed. We didn't capture it, and I think that's I think that's an important lesson, that you need to press the record button if you're going to test something with data. Sometimes it's there accidentally. We will work using a recruitment platform that we followed their rules for, and sometimes you have to design it and record the data. Certainly from my experience, I found that keeping engaged with candidates is really important to make sure that they turn up, and also making sure there's really clear expectations. I have called candidates that haven't turned up. I mean, most of them don't answer the phone, but the ones that do were like, oh, I just didn't feel ready for it. I thought, I was going to fail the interview anyway. And you think, oh, have I failed here in communicating? So in the absence of data, I'm always somebody who ask people, or asking people reinforces the data. Getting feedback from candidates or customers, really, really super important as well.
Yeah, and this could also maybe lead to an interesting point. I mean, in terms of, have you seen cases where people have a certain opinion or a certain process that they want to follow, and therefore, we talked about bias briefly in data, but they find data to back that argument up? I mean, there's almost data on everything at this point. You could probably find surveys or information that backs up an argument, 1 in 100, for example. But have you seen that happen before, where people use data to justify decisions where you've sort of questioned the data they're using and came up with maybe a better solution to try and find objectively the best approach to take?
All the time. So it's if you know the conclusion that you want to have, and you will not change your mind, you will always find the data that supports it. I think it's really important to be open-minded and focus on what problem you're trying to solve. Think about the long term. Think about where your mission is, and actually, I'd rather take the painful path now and find out that it's wrong than to have poor outcomes in years to come. When I'm working with somebody that looks like this, look, you've got to be careful not to ram data down people's throat and to tell them that they're wrong. You want to go on the journey with them together, and taking the emotion out of it, talking to them about, okay, well, don't you tell me what your end goal is. You might think that's the conclusion, but what outcome do you want from that conclusion? Let's be focused on the positive outcomes rather than assuming what causes the positive outcomes. I think if you approach it in a positive mindset, you try and take the emotion out, you mature about it, you can win people over. And for me, it's a really good feeling when I've myth busted and then we've implemented the idea and we see better results. You see the light bulb moment with people go, oh yeah, okay, my ego's damaged, but I'm actually pretty happy with the outcomes.
No, yeah, I think my ego could take a hit if I'm getting a good result as well, to be honest. I mean, it's interesting because I mean we spoke about culture briefly as well. I think that could be an important part of culture then, being open-minded, you mentioned, which I thought was an interesting point. I mean, is that something that you try and incorporate as well when it comes to team management and company culture? You know, this idea of not questioning everything necessarily, but still being quite open-minded, open to different ideas. Would you say that's an important part of running a data function as well?
Yeah, it's certainly something in my personal culture. Now, when building a team, I don't want to hire on my personal culture. I want to hire within the company culture. And actually, if my personal culture and the company culture aren't aligned, why am I part of the team?
Yeah.
So I think coming in as a leader to see that really close alignment between what you believe in and how you like to operate and how the company works is really important, because it makes the rest of the process very natural, very easy to do. So yeah, I work on that. I like to find people who are problem solvers. I like to find people who have strong convictions loosely held. So when they believe in something, they will fight their corner. But if someone puts a piece of evidence in front of them, they'll listen to the evidence and they'll respond in the right way. And having people that are very collaborative. I don't like working with mavericks, people who want to take all the credit. It's either the team wins or the team loses. And for me, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, makes sense. Got it. So let's go on to, if we're looking at things more on a macro scale, because you mentioned earlier as well, and obviously your experience is predominantly in financial services, and you said how data and financial services is way ahead of other areas. When you started out initially, I mean, would you say right now, what other industries in addition to the financial services industry would you say data has become increasingly most important to, if you could name some?
Well, I guess because I've always worked in the financial services industry, I don't always have the best appreciation of where other industries are. I do like to attend a lot of data events and network with people outside of financial services. Really good for learning about how different problems are being solved and so forth. And when I go to these events, I think that actually some other industries are taking over, particularly those that have lower levels of regulation. I think that rightly so, there's a high level of regulation in finance, in healthcare, these industries, and actually the compliance element of it. I think they build some really robust, good quality solutions, but there's an overly focus on they're probably still more advanced in the data governance and maybe less advanced in other areas. But yeah, I mean, my feel is across the board, all industries are maturing in data. They've come a long way, but there's probably a long way to go as well for many firms.
Yeah. And if we're thinking in terms of timescales, I mean, let's say, how much do you think data will change, say, in the next 5 or so years? Where do you see, or how do you see data advancing in the near future?
Yeah, on one hand, I think there's a kind of a path to maturity that, like I say, many firms are going on, and for those companies, it's probably for me quite predictable, that they'll just kind of go on that path. Change, maturity, it can take a long time, sometimes a lot longer than we expect it to be. I mean, how often do we look at this year's goals and think they're actually quite similar to last year's goals, even though we've been proud about the outcomes that we've achieved? I think for those maybe, let's say, more market leading, I think harnessing generative AI is still up there, but there's I think there'll be a lot of evolution in generative AI, and I think we'll see more things come out, things that we don't necessarily know about at the moment. So that's the magic of it being a young industry.
Sure. And along those lines as well with generative AI, and just data's advancement as well in general. I mean, obviously, repetitive tasks are increasingly becoming replaced. How do you see data teams evolving in response to that?
Yeah, so I suppose that you can think of generative AI in two ways here. I mean, you can probably think of it in more ways, but for simplicity here. So you can think about how do I build products we're using generative AI. I think that, again, there was a lot of hype over there. People trying to use generative AI for use cases that actually conventional analytics would have been better to solve, or even no analytics at all. And then the other one is that productivity element. Either we see sales might be using that to write like outreach emails. We also see people who code using it to write code as well. And I think that can speed up a lot of repetitive or manual or time-consuming tasks, and to get you to an average level quickly. I think that we'll really see people who are highly skilled in their discipline be able to refine that. Part of generative AI, or the outcomes of it, is I'm just going to get more spam in my inbox. So actually getting something that's going to get spotted actually becomes more of a skill. So yeah, I think there's a huge enablement there, but also there's a risk that you can fall behind in terms of skills. So that critical thinking and using creativity and being ahead of that benchmark of generative AI tools is important.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point actually when it comes to being ahead of the benchmark, because at least I can speak on the go-to-market side and the sales side. You mentioned earlier, for example, making those repetitive tasks, let's say if it's cold email outreach, making that more automated. I think there might be a transition period in the market where that works for a bit. And then, as you say, the market would respond to that, because then everyone starts adopting that technology, and then all hiring managers or all leaders end up with, lots of spam in their inbox, and then the market changes and there needs to be something else that goes to the next level. So I suppose even for data teams, would you say that's also something else, to take into consideration, is how is the market reacting to these advancements, and how do we stay ahead of the curve? Is that something else that even on the data side of the business is also going to be quite important as well?
Yeah, so less so on the data team directly, but on the internal customers.
Sure.
Data are going to be working with the sales team, the marketing team, the HR team, all of this, and we're going to be, hopefully they're partnering together to bring that best practice in the art of the possible to support and to enable them. So I think it's important there to watch out and to support your internal customers to use these new tools in the right in the best ways. There's a great deal of responsibility to help out there.
Sure. Now, staying on the macro point as well, I mean, is there any area in the world of data which you would say is being overlooked? Maybe an opportunity or a particular area that it just isn't being talked about as much. Anything that comes to mind in that regard?
I actually think we're getting close to a peak maturity. I'll kind of give you two examples here. So number one, we talked about data scientists before, and would they be your first hire? Now, data scientists in a way should be your last hire, because then you've got all of your ducks in a row to enable them. Now data scientists kind of became your hot new role in the industry 10 or so years ago. And then I feel like it's kind of worked backwards. So you've then had data engineers came in, and that was a hot role. And then data analysts. I mean, data analysts have always been around, but the role of a data analyst kind of changed, and that kind of became a hot role. And most recently, it's more about data product and data governance. Now, in a way, this is like in reverse of what I think you should hire into a team. But there, I kind of see a very full stack team of skills that can both be self-contained as a data function, but also you partner with all corners of the business. I can't think of many more data roles that should be coming out or that I've seen emerging in market leading firms. I also think that data as a service is going to be a growing industry. You see how big software as a service is, and either as new companies or actually those SaaS companies branching out into new verticals, very, very complementary. Data teams are built on top of tech. So that, I think, is a very untapped area of the market. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there, both in terms of new companies, new best practices, and how actually bringing in a third party like that might actually accelerate some companies along their maturity journey.
Yeah, definitely. And the point that you mentioned earlier as well, when it came to potentially not new roles coming out necessarily, but I suppose higher skilled people working in data. I guess the challenge there would obviously be, well, would there then be less of them because they'll be doing, they'll be taking on more work, and then what's going to happen to other positions that might be made redundant? But I suppose that's probably something for all of the tech industry, or all industries in general, to have to contend with when it comes to technological advancements. But I mean, what would be your thoughts in that regard as
well? Well, we hear a lot about there being a huge skills gap, and how that's that skills gap may be growing all the time. So actually, improvements in productivity will help to close that skills gap, or just reduce the amount of how fast it grows. I also think that advancements in technology are going to make people happier in their role. I mean, to use one example that I saw early in my career in financial services was in credit underwriting. So you make a loan application, it gets to a human, the human reviews your application, and they decide whether you're accepted or approved. And then came in credit scoring and automated decisioning. And all of a sudden, you had, okay, we're going to 40% is going to be accepted, 40% is going to be declined, and it's the 20% in the middle that go to the underwriter. So your first reaction might be, hey, you've killed 80% of the work. But what happens there is you've actually, you've reduced your cost base per application, so you can scale your business. You get more applications in, that helps the business to grow. You get more volume, and as an underwriter, you then get to spend more time on the more complex deals. So you make better decisions, and it's more exciting. And this is not just me who thinks this. I sat and worked with underwriters, and they were more excited through automation. That there's always someone who doesn't like it, and they're scared and things, but most of them they found it empowering. So I think it's really important that when this technology comes along and it has the ability to empower us, that we make sure that we are positive about the outlook, because it's very easy for people to feel negative, but it's also very easy to be excited and to be an advocate on that journey.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's probably a good point to leave things on a positive note. So yeah, I was curious to see how you're going to answer that question, and if it was going to end negatively or positively. It's good that it's ending positively, but
oh no, I always like to end things on a high.
No, love it. But no, thanks so much for coming on, Mike. It's been great. We should definitely do this again sometime. But for those of you who are listening and watching, you can check this out. It will come out in our latest newsletter, released every Friday, and then we'll also be distributing it on LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify. Once again, Mike, thanks so much, and
My pleasure.
Let's definitely do it again.